Fighting the Doomsday Clock, how media research can help illuminate and therefore hopefully help tackle some of the world's biggest problems. And this really is us trying to argue that media research and the kind of questions that we ask as media and cultural scholars are really fundamental to both understanding and therefore trying to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. So that's really our pitch today for this workshop. Now, who we all are I'm John Cook, who's kicking off the first few slides, and then I'm going to be handing over to my colleague, Dr. Catriona Miller, who's going to do some of the presentation, and then also my colleague, Dr. Andrew McWhirter. And all three of us are from the Department of Media and Journalism at Glasgow Caledonian University. And we're also members as well of an associated research group, which has fairly recently been launched within the university over the last year, called the Media and Culture Research Group. And this group has been meeting really to talk over media and cultural research issues in relation to some of the wider university research agendas, for example, around sustainable development goals and developing certainly work that might help the common good in terms of the university's mission. Now, this is what I want to start with, which and really is the premise for the whole talk, which is the Doomsday Clock. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Doomsday Clock, but this is really it's a symbol that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been addressing since 1947. So, atomic scientists, or originally it was atomic scientists, at the beginning of the Cold War in 1947, created the Doomsday Clock as a symbol for how close the world is, or otherwise, to imminent apocalypse. And of course, back in the Cold War days, that was very much defined as the nuclear apocalypse. And this clock has been running, symbolic clock, has been running since 1947 as a kind of measure of the dangers that humanity faces from a kind of man-made catastrophe. And you probably would expect that during certain phases of the Cold War, that doomsday clock would be pretty close to midnight. And during the Cold War, the closest it ever came to midnight was 2 minutes to midnight, actually in 1947 when it was first set up. But here's the kicker, as it were, and the slightly disturbing thing that forms the premise of our collective talk today. And it's this really, that in 2019, the clock was moved to 100 seconds to midnight. So in not 2 minutes, as at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and America were squaring up with nuclear weapons against her, but now in our era, the clock has been the closest it's ever been to midnight, just 100 seconds to midnight. So that's pretty scary. It was first moved in 2020 to 100 seconds to midnight. And in 2021, in January 2021, that was renewed. And as you can see in the image, the two people appeared with their masks on, symbolic, of course, about the current pandemic. So why is it, and this is the premise of today's talk, why is it that the doomsday clock is now just 100 seconds to midnight? It's obviously a concern for humanity. What is the underlying causes? Well, interestingly, the scientists point to three main aspects. And the really interesting thing from our point of view in terms of research at Glasgow Caledonian University is to outline these three main aspects and also to argue that they're all interrelated. Now, the first main aspect is the continuing proliferation of nuclear weapons. You might have thought nuclear weapons was something that we had consigned to the history of the Cold War, but no, nuclear proliferation is alive and well and unfortunately thriving in the 21st century. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in later sections of my talk. Then we've got, which I think most of us would acknowledge is the immediate apocalyptic threat to mankind, the accelerated threat from man-made climate change. And of course, we know a lot about that, we hear a lot about that, and that is one of the world's increasing concerns. But interestingly, the final interrelated aspect of the three main aspects that the scientists regard as some of the world's greatest problems facing humanity is the third one, which absolutely is central to obviously the work that the Media and Journalism Department do at Glasgow Caledonian University. And that is the idea that a degraded, quote unquote, media environment is preventing humanity from acknowledging, first of all, and then acting on the first two issues of nuclear weapons proliferation and climate change. Now, interestingly, the scientists in their latest bulletin, which you can read, I mean, I've put the link up in an earlier slide if any of you want to check out their current statement for 2021. The scientists talk about three main aspects of this degraded media environment. First of all, cyber warfare, in which state and other private actors are using the internet to wage various forms of internet warfare on the populace. And that, as I say, can be anything from foreign governments to the kind of cyber attacks that recently have even afflicted this university within the last week. Also, disinformation, the idea of planting false or misleading stories into mainstream media news outlets, such as in the headlines on the right there, that climate change is, for example, just one giant big fraud. Examples of clear disinformation when it's clear scientifically that climate change is a reality. And then we have the ubiquitous and famous fake news as promulgated by one Donald Trump, former president of the United States, who claimed that most mainstream media outlets were extolling fake news. But of course, it's no secret that the main promulgator of fake news was Donald Trump himself. For example, as in this celebrated tweet or notorious tweet from 2012, before Trump became president, in which he claimed, quote unquote, that the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese to make US manufacturing uncompetitive. Now, that could be dismissed as the ramblings of somebody who's scientifically illiterate, if it was not the case that then this outrageous tweet then gets amplified exponentially and circulated all around social media. As a form, if you like, of propaganda, in the sense that social media through our mobile phones can be used as a propaganda tool carried around in everybody's pockets. So whether you're on the Trump camp and believe his tweets, or whether you just retweet them because you're showing to your friends how astonished you are by his tweets, doesn't matter. He's being amplified and being given a platform in which to spread this kind of scientifically illiterate disinformation. So there is the three main related problems that the current group of scientists in 2021 see as some of the greatest problems facing mankind. And of course, this is to leave aside entirely the effects of the current global pandemic, which the scientists say is, well, hopefully just a temporary phase and that we'll be out of it fairly soon. Well, one hopes. But you can see from all of this that humanity is facing some pretty big, almost apocalyptic problems. Now, over to my colleague, Dr. Catriona Miller, who's going to talk about ideas of conceptualizing this notion of apocalypse.
Thanks, John. In this presentation, we are looking at very real problems facing the world right now in what certainly feels like a time of urgent crisis. But media studies also brings to the table, as John has kind of alluded to, the recognition that the depiction of these problems within the media sphere is also a representation of the issues. And as such, this brings with it an element of imagination. How we conceptualize the problems, that is, how we imagine them to be, is important because that starts to tell us how we might respond to them. Do we stick our heads in the sand and hope for the best? Is that all we can do? Do we try and work with positivity and hope for change instead? How the problems are represented matters to how we respond to them. And the media, of course, has a key role to play in winning hearts and minds, in persuading people, perhaps, of the necessity for change. But although the term apocalypse is frequently employed when considering any kind of end time scenario, certainly something that the climate crisis might evoke for us. The term deserves closer inspection because it is actually a very loaded word. And maybe it doesn't quite mean what we think it means. Maybe it's not quite as bad. The word itself, apocalypse, is from the Greek word apocalypsis, found in Revelation. In fact, is the opening words of the book in the Bible. It simply means uncovering, or as the book itself is translated into English, a revelation. So the book of Revelation itself was just an uncovering of what was to come. So it was part of, it's the most famous apocalyptic text, but it's actually only a later version of a genre of writing in a Jewish tradition that dates back to around 200 BCE. What's interesting for us here, however, is that the composition of these kinds of texts coincide with historical periods of great upheaval, politically and culturally. There are pre-Christian Jewish texts, there are the Christian texts themselves, but there are many other Coptic, Syriac, and even Islamic versions of Apocalypse that all arise at times of crisis and change. These happen throughout the Middle Ages in Europe and the Near East in many different guises. These writings are really imaginative responses to catastrophic times, attempting to place some kind of order onto the chaos. They're also revolutionary. They're radically challenging the world order. John J. Collins, who's a leading writer in the field of biblical apocalyptic literature, suggests that the genre is really designed to challenge worldviews in what he calls a revolution of the imagination. To imagine apocalypse is to challenge common perceptions. And he calls it a revolution because it can foster dissatisfaction with the present and generate visions of what might be. So the legacy of the apocalypses includes a powerful rhetoric for denouncing the deficiencies of the world. And it also includes the conviction that the world as it is now is not the end. So apocalypses are not actually about the end of the world. They are really about the end of the world as we know it, in order to let something else, something perhaps better, take its place. Of course, historically, these apocalypses are written within a religious context, and that's not what we're really suggesting here. But that revolution of the imagination, that idea that something better, something more can happen, is really important. Since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, Western culture has concentrated on a sense of development and progress, and apocalypses as such were relatively rare in literature and popular culture until the invention of the nuclear bomb towards the end of the Second World War. And then they suddenly became very prevalent indeed. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Catriona. So let's look in turn at these various versions of the apocalypse, starting with, as Catriona has said, the post-war traditional view. I'm talking about, when I say traditional, since the mid-20th century, a way of looking at apocalypse, which since the mid-20th century has been defined, certainly the end of the world as we know it has often been associated with nuclear war. So this is the traditional image of apocalypse, and a little bit later we'll focus on more recent visions of apocalypse. But let's take the nuclear one first. Now, sadly, as I alluded to at the start of my section of the presentation, well, we tend to think of the threat of nuclear apocalypse as something associated with the Cold War and that it's all now dead and gone, thank goodness. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And the threat of nuclear holocaust is not just something belonging to the past. It's actually something that is growing and is increasingly prevalent now. Hence the scientists moving the doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight. Now, here's some recent stats on world nuclear inventory. So this is the stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the world. This has been prepared by the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and it's up to date to 2020, which is the latest figures that I was able to find. And what it shows is that while in the old days it was really just the United States and Russia squaring off against each other, now we've seen increasing proliferation of nuclear weapons to other countries. Now, interestingly, China, which has long had the bomb, actually in the days of the Cold War only had a limited stockpile of nuclear weapons. But the big story since the end of the Cold War has been the exponential growth of Chinese military capacity in all sorts of different forms, but including the development of greater numbers of nuclear warheads. France and the United Kingdom have long been part of the nuclear powers, but they've been joined in recent years by Pakistan, India, and of course, a lot of us know about North Korea and have heard about North Korea and the dangers of proliferation there. But perhaps less discussed is the axis of China, Pakistan, and India, where, for example, Pakistan and India are enemies, but so too are both of them enemies of China. And India in particular fears Chinese military growth and the growth of China's nuclear fleets. So really, folks, we're looking at a proliferation of nuclear weapons with new types of ever more dangerous weaponry, including developments now of hypersonic nuclear weapons and also developments of armed military drones. And one of the problems that has arisen since 2019 and which has led the scientists to worry about the dangers of nuclear proliferation is the fact that Russia and America have both pulled out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which constrained the growth of intermediate nuclear missiles. So both are quite happily now outside of the treaties and developing their stockpiles ever more further and ever more into new advanced technology. So it's a dangerous situation. It doesn't belong just to the Cold War past. Now, while climate change and other forms of apocalypse like pandemics are much discussed in the media, this is something that you're not going to hear so much about in the media, and that doesn't appear to be so overtly discussed. Now, being somebody as a researcher who's interested in television drama, I'm quite interested in how representations play out in television drama. Now, a lot of you probably have seen, if you've seen nuclear weapons and nuclear power discussed at all, it's probably been from watching that superb mini-series recently called Chernobyl. But a text that I'd want to draw your attention to that is a rather interesting one of depicting nuclear attack in the 21st century rather than old images from the 20th century. It's a drama that was written by Russell T Davies of Doctor Who fame and transmitted a couple of years ago by the BBC called Years and Years. And in that, in the best traditions of science fiction, Russell T Davies, the writer, looks forward to the years beyond 2019 and imagining what life might be like for a particular family in Britain. And in the best traditions of science fiction, he uses the future format to comment on present day issues such as poverty, inequality, but also the dangers of nuclear confrontation. And in a key scene in episode 1, the Lyons family, who you see portrayed there on the left-hand image, watch in horror as a nuclear alert is launched on the UK. Sirens start to wail, and the government takes over the airwaves and gives emergency broadcasts saying, effectively giving the 3-minute warning. Now, that's not just fiction. If there were ever, God forbid, to be a nuclear strike on the UK, that's exactly what would happen. The government are mandated to take over the airwaves to broadcast emergency messages. Now, thankfully for the Lyons family, the fictitious Lyons family, this is just a false alarm. But I think for viewers, what was interesting was it was what I call the shock of the now, actually seeing the potential for nuclear conflict happening in a recreation of the present day was quite powerful. So I'll draw your attention to that text. If any of you are interested as well, I've written a little bit about it online. Now, Russell T Davies was working within a tradition of envisaging the traditional apocalypse, the nuclear apocalypse. And for those of you with longer memories, you might remember being terrified in the 1980s by watching dramas like Threads, which dramatized what might happen if there was a nuclear strike on Sheffield, England. And perhaps the granddaddy of them all, in terms of these kind of visions of traditional nuclear apocalypse, if you like, is a film that I've done a lot of research on called The War Game, which was directed by a young director at the BBC called Peter Watkins, who basically recreated what it would be like if a nuclear bomb fell on Kent, England. And so successful was he in doing this using dramatized documentary techniques, very powerful documentary style techniques, that the film went on to win an Oscar in Hollywood, but not before being sensationally banned by the BBC, who produced the film but refused to transmit it on television. It gained only a limited cinema release. And recent years, I've done research on this and discovered that the BBC colluded with the government of the day to really make sure that it would not be shown on television for fear of panicking the populace at that time. So the War Game remains a kind of totem, if you like, of representations of nuclear conflict. It's still a very, very powerful film. And as we will see a little bit later, it can be used today as a powerful tool, effectively, of raising the consciousness of young people today about how the nuclear apocalypse, unfortunately, is still with us. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Catriona now, who's going to talk about more recent conceptualizations of apocalypse.
Since the atomic bombs dropped in 1945, then, imaginations have absolutely been gripped by the potential that humanity now had to destroy the Earth. It's not too big a leap, said one writer, to suggest that modern media, particularly television and film, occupy a role in our society analogous to religious narratives, art and drama in the pre-modern period. It's a source of theatre for the collective imagination. And Jungian psychologist Ortiz Hill took things a step further, describing a new kind of apocalyptic imaginary geography that runs alongside the everyday world. He said we live in effect in two worlds. In the foreground, our daily preoccupations and activities, and behind that, a fantastic landscape of terror, invisible poison, mutant fish, random violence, underground shelters, blistered skin, lost children, ashes, and ruination. It's there in our dreams and on our screens. From the 1950s onwards, there was a marked rise in the number of films and TV series with apocalyptic themes. John has spoken about some of the nuclear-related ones, but in the UK in 1953, the Quatermass experiment, where an alien entity has the ability to end life on Earth, was an early television drama hit. And then there was things like The Planet of the Apes from 1968, when Charlton Heston realizes he's been on Earth the whole time, which no longer belongs to humanity, but to the apes. These kind of films were growing in popularity all the time. But from the 1970s onwards, there was a growing fear about what was happening to the natural world. Even if it wasn't being talked about at sort of government policy levels, it was there in that imaginary geography running alongside us. Food of the Gods was a very loose adaptation of an H.G. Wells novel in which a mysterious substance caused insects, rats, and all kinds of animals to grow giant and attack humans. The giant chicken was a famous moment in that film. But in other films at the time, there were giant ants, giant rabbits, yes, giant rabbits, killer bees, piranhas, other kinds of natural disasters, volcanoes, earthquakes, of all kinds, began to put visions of spectacular apocalyptic disaster up on the screens. By 1998, we had 2 asteroid-related films with deep impact in Armageddon, followed in the noughties by films like The Day After Tomorrow, with its vision of Snowball Earth, 2012, which seemed to contain every kind of natural disaster. There was also science fiction like Children of Men, where babies were no longer being born to Interstellar, as well as, of course, Contagion from 2011 about a global pandemic. Zombies have been a particular feature, a post-nuclear invention by George Romero from 1968. These were also on the rise, with the Walking Dead TV series beginning in 2010, which has been a spectacular hit globally for AMC. These are examples. These are a lot of world endings, an epidemic of them, you might say. Collectively, we have been gripped by the imaginary geography of apocalypse running alongside our everyday lives for decades now. But the urgency of the climate crisis is forcing us to move from these nightmarish visions to starting to engage with its reality. We know the problems are there. The time is now to move away from fantasy visions of destruction towards tangible solutions. It's over to you now, Andrew.
Thanks, Catriona. So how do the media industries intersect with the most pressing issue of climate change? So we've recognised in recent years that the media industries themselves, while less obvious polluters, if you like, than the dirty industries, do still output a substantial amount of carbon emissions. Let's take some regions such as LA, for instance. They contribute more greenhouse gas emissions from film production than manufacturing, clothing, or the hotel industries. And remarkably, only oil refining is actually worse. Now, we don't tend to think of any of this when consuming media, and whether that's entertainment media or otherwise. So therefore, let's begin with a look at the more obvious way in which people assume media to engage with climate change, and that's through, as we've been discussing so far, editorial and content. Now, within our area, there's few more controversial things than saying media causes an effect on someone, but at least we can say that media has contributed in some ways to behaviour changes. So consider, I'm sure you're all familiar with Blue Planet's Ocean Plastics segment that influenced a lot of UK sectors to take action on single-use plastics, or perhaps more recently, Channel 4's It's a Sin contributed to a huge surge in AIDS testing. So effectively, how we portray sustainability affects how audiences then interpret it. On the slide you can see here, we have really TV as a case study. So in conjunction with BAFTA and Industry Authority on Sustainability, Albert, Deloitte used data analytics of the subtitles on all the main UK terrestrial channels over successive years, that was 2019-2020, to see how often the topic of climate change and then related sustainability words were mentioned. The results of 2 years worth of subtitles to Save the World reports data don't necessarily make for positive reading. Even if the 2020 data, that is, shows that mentions of climate change have actually shot up from the previous year by roughly about 10,000 additional mentions. But it is still poor, as you can see, in comparison to both usual and topical words. I'm guessing the substantial portion of the 81,510 mentions of the word murder are likely attributable to the reruns of the classic Scottish police drama Taggart, but of course I jest. Let's turn our attention to social media, because some think that we're actually just at the start of a meaningful conversations about climate within the digital sphere. And certainly for all its ills and Greta memes aside, social media has sometimes been a counter to that sort of 80% doom and gloom narrative that we see for more traditional media forms. So there's certainly examples of more positive media messaging here. For instance, just search climate change on YouTube and you'll see an example of this with the popular Dear Future Generations video by Prince Ia, still actually appearing on the first page of the YouTube rank there after 5 years. And then again, changing how we talk about climate action is further demonstrated in a light-hearted comparison video by the School of Life channel. While this is actually far less a popular example than the Dear Generations video, Micro-influence is actually still a really important tool for positive climate change messaging. So this light-hearted video, for instance, helps us understand why, as a global population searching for information online, somehow Taylor Swift's legs are more appealing than the serious subject of climate change. Then we've also got Instagram's Save the Planet, also a popular organising catalogue, growing in popularity every day, and such hashtags like this are invaluable to find work in climate initiatives. Some, for instance, driven by massive influencers such as Mark Rober, Mr. Beast, and others with hashtag Team Trees, for instance. But let's face it, your average climate influencer is not Greta, for one, and is not as popular as, say, maybe someone who's a Marilyn Monroe impersonator on TikTok with 10 million followers, one of our own alumni, by the way, but they are still very important. Sometimes, as if I need to tell you, and you didn't know already, social is also problematic. So the Earth is flat, again. The Megalodon is out there in the oceans. The FBI killed all the mermaids, QAnon, and more. We can laugh, but and while scholars and activists say that we shouldn't waste time on, in their words, idiots and climate deniers, we should actually be quite sympathetic to people who believe in such things. For instance, conspiracy theories work best in periods when people are desperate, confused, and they see little hope actually in their future. So as you can imagine, this is obviously a problem then for communicating climate messaging itself. It's natural that people don't want to discuss overwhelming topics. Social psychologist Per Espen Stoknes talks of a range of barriers to effective climate communication, but among these, doom, that's messaging that puts people off because it talks of loss or sacrifice, and denial, that's facts make people feel guilty and fearful, so they tend to want to avoid them, are among probably the most important to those tasked with creating media content. Kinafuchi and others argue that throughout the pandemic, this is an information period that was dubbed infodemic by the World Health Organization, we saw a host of nature is healing content. Yes, there were plummeting greenhouse gases and improved air quality. If you lived in a city, you live in a city, you'll know that yourself. But this sort of framing is actually problematic on 3 different counts. So firstly, it sets up the tension of humans versus nature. This fits into a longer problematic narrative of humans conquering nature. So therefore, it also fails to take into account the way forward of seeing humans as part of the ecosystem and biosphere, not somehow detached from it. Secondly, it's not the whole picture, as you can see here, because overall carbon emissions still climbed. And then finally, some information was just false. So to take one of Kinafuchi's examples, the stories about Venice that spread on Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook, and they claimed that the swans that had always been there had somehow returned, and then other pictures of photos of happy dolphins, effectively, that were actually from hundreds of miles away in Sardinia. So the danger here is that actually even accurate changes are somehow diluted in a fast-moving memification of events. And all of this is part of a wider problem that the Atomic Scientist Bulletin refers to as the wider degraded media environment, as John has talked about, and we'll talk further to now.
So this idea of the degraded media environment, I think this image that I've put up here just sums it all up of what happens when a media environment goes wrong, and how, in many respects, if we were to tackle some of the world's greatest problems, the media environment, the attitude environment, the environment that creates attitudes that can then produce change, are absolutely fundamentally related to solving some of these problems, and the way in which our media is framed, and the way in which the industries are structured. And in the United States of America, the degraded media environment couldn't be seen more starkly than with the events of 6 January 2021, when a mob of people stormed the US Capitol building under the false assumption that the election had somehow been stolen, the presidential election had somehow been stolen from Donald Trump. And the very simple question to ask is, how is it possible for so many people to be so fatally misguided into believing such patently false claims? Because if they can believe that, then they can believe all sorts of myths about climate change, for example. Well, very simply, what went on in the United States in January is, I would argue, as somebody who's looked a little bit at these issues historically, is part of the long history of psychological warfare and propaganda that was perhaps best encapsulated by the notorious Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister in the 1930s and 1940s in Nazi Germany, who talked about propaganda being the art of repetition, in which if you repeat a message enough and enough times, then eventually enough people will start to believe it. Goebbels' boss, Adolf Hitler, talked about the big lie, that the bigger the lie, the more likely people are going to believe it, because they can't believe that anyone would promote such a lie. And in many respects, that is the kind of playbook that Donald Trump was working from when he claimed to the public that the election had been stolen. Now, you might say, well, Trump is now history, Joe Biden is in charge, but just look at what's happening in the Republican Party in the United States, where that big lie about a stolen election is convulsing that party to such an extent that it's now become the cult of Trump, that you define yourself as against other Republicans by whether you believe the election has been stolen or not. So that traditional Republicans within that party, such as Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, have been sidelined because they simply refuse to subscribe to believing a lie which has been patently demonstrated as false. Now, Trump and his ilk could not survive and thrive except within a US media environment which provided the perfect soil for these kind of lies to be echoed and amplified. And I've just got a couple of graphs here to show you before we move to the final stages of the talk today in terms of issues of tackling these things. So, for example, since the percentage of Republicans in this graph here from Ipsos indicates that if you don't watch television, you're more likely to find common ground with your political opponent. But if you watch a lot of television, the polarization starts to become very pronounced. And also Democrats, for example, trust a number of news sources, while Republicans tend to trust one source over any other, i.e. Fox News. So what we're seeing is an increasingly polarized media environment in the United States. And of course, the United States is one of the world's biggest polluters in terms of climate change. And a lot of it stems back to the scrapping in 1987 of the Fairness Doctrine, which allowed the Fairness Doctrine was an attempt to create balance so that in news broadcasts, so that if one side puts an opinion, it has to be counterbalanced with another. With the decline of that, it's led to a polarized environment in which you can in a segmented market environment, you choose which news channel you want to watch in accordance with your beliefs. Now, you might think that's all just in the United States, but in Britain, we're about to see the launch of GB News, an anti-BBC, anti-woke, as it calls itself, news channel catering for the right of centre viewer. So some of these patterns that we've seen in the States with Fox News could be coming to our shores as well. So increasingly, we are living in a polarized media climate. And to illustrate how this can affect climate change, look, for example, at the following graph, which indicates that in 1997, there was general consensus about climate change, but by 2016, the eve of Trump's election, there had been increasing political polarization. So no longer was there a consensus about climate change. Okay, so these are some of the problems that we've diagnosed. How can we tackle them? Over to Catriona.
Thanks. It can feel like that there are an overwhelming number of problems. And the temptation is just to throw up our hands and say it's too hard and hope somebody else has the answers. But we don't accept that. We say everybody doesn't have to do everything, but everyone can do something. And of course, we have the research that staff is doing, and you've probably guessed that I tend to look at that imaginary geography from a depth psychology perspective. And Andrew and John will say a little bit more about their own work in a moment. But thinking about what was closest to hand to us and what we have the skills to do in the department has led us to do a few things. We've introduced a new module about creativity for our undergraduates, where they consider creativity in their own creative practice, and then we all try to get better at it. But in what is perhaps an unusual move, we embedded industry training on sustainability into the module so that they do both together. Andrew will say a bit more about that. But in this module, we bring together the facts about the climate crisis amidst a module that is encouraging them to open up, to be curious about the world and themselves, and then respond to a brief. So far, it seems to be working. We also work with our postgraduate scriptwriters in MATV fiction writing, and we do talk a lot in that programme about their imaginations and their drama ideas, and again, encourage them to be playful and challenging and to think about what the solutions might look like. And we've also launched an arts-based PhD project researching how to bring the pressing issues of the climate crisis to a TV drama audience in a way they can learn from and spark their own imaginations to start solving some of these concerns that we've raised. We got an unprecedented number of people inquiring about that PhD, which shows us that there are plenty of clever, creative, imaginative people out there who care deeply about these issues. Everybody doesn't have to do everything, but everyone can do something. Over to you, Andrew.
We're kind of push for time because I think we want to at least have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll just try and skip through these as quick as I can. The slide here is really to illustrate what I talked about at the very start when I introduced the impact of the media industries, and sometimes this is called the material turn in media studies, and it can be difficult for media people to get their head around as well. Can you believe that they actually rolled the last coal car into Kodak Park in New York State as recently as 2018? So we should definitely see the media as made up of devices that come from finite resources. Just have a think about what's in your pockets or with your smartphones with cobalt and lithium, etc. That can be quite difficult to get media people's heads around because they tend to deal with messages in the way that messages come to us through news and reality TV. But to quote Kate Soper's What is Nature, she says it isn't language which has a hole in its ozone layer. So things become even more problematic, though, because we do have language that masks the environmental realities. So think about the cloud, for instance. The cloud isn't just something that's intangible. It is often energy hungry data centers that often run on dirty energy, replacing servers twice every decade, for instance. The internet's something that cuts through mountains and underwater cables and has to be maintained effectively. So you can imagine then when you get more traditional industries, if we know this already about digital media, you get more traditional industries like film and TV bringing more and more online with the cloud-based services and editing, etc., then it brings even more added challenges. So while our research covers this whole spectrum, it's really in recent years that we've focused on the film and TV sector, mainly studying the progress of the organization called Albert. Now, Albert began as a carbon calculator created in 2010 by the BBC, before then being developed by BAFTA into a standalone, non-competitive industry leader for all things sustainability. It's now 10 years old, has many major partners, so Warner, Netflix, and it's now a mandatory step in the production processes for content at the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and BT Sport, etc. Just to give you some stats, 1 hour's worth of TV, that's basically everything included from travel and cooking fuels, is 13.5 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. That's effectively charging 1.6 million smartphones or running 2 to 3 homes on electricity for a year. That's about 17 acres of forests over a single year just to sequester that from the atmosphere, just 1 hour of telly. So Albert's also about content to come full circle again. So it wants to have productions say something positive about climate change. So in 2021 to get the full accreditation, and that's what programs actually have to do. So have a look at the end next time you're watching something on Sky, BT Sport, BBC iPlayer. You likely see this logo at the end if they've achieved the certification. Now we're embedding that into our programs, as Catriona has said. This started in 2017, where we worked with a handful of higher education partners around the UK alongside BAFTA and Albert. And then in 2021, I think we're now pushing upwards of 30 memberships. GCU is still the only and remains the only representative in Scotland, so it's quite a selling point for us. So what does it actually do? Well, it assesses students on climate literacy, on making a personal commitment, on using the Albert calculator, which is really a must if you want to be a runner on shows like EastEnders, etc. And then finally on pitching a positive screen production. In this academic session, we saw our first cohort of certified Albert grads as well. So while we consider that teaching climate, the accelerated era of climate change to higher education students is most important, I think John's now going to talk about how we don't neglect also younger audiences as well when it comes to existential risk.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. And I'm aware, obviously, of time, so I'll just run through these slides very, very quickly. So we've been engaging with young people, particularly trying to raise their awareness of the nuclear issue, because it remains a fact that Scotland, if there was ever to be God forbid, a nuclear conflagration, Scotland would be one of the targets, because obviously the UK nuclear submarine fleet is based at the Gairloch, 25 miles from Glasgow. So in 2019, in November 2019, we got a bunch of young people, about 100 young people, into the university to really show them the film The War Game, which dramatized a nuclear attack on Kent, really to raise their awareness of the fact that nuclear weapons is not just something belonging to the Cold War, that it's still an issue today. And the film, even though it's 50 years old, still has a very, very powerful effect on young people. So much so that the young people were then invited to the Scottish Parliament in February 2020, just a few weeks before the pandemic struck, in which the film was screened to MSPs as well as a group of selected senior school pupils. The event, GCU-sponsored event, had a very profound effect on those who watched the film and then debated the issues afterwards. Bill Kidd, the MSP for Annisland, who is the chair of the cross-party Scottish Parliament group on nuclear, was very moved after the film screening and said we must never allow this to happen. And school children as well who attended were very moved by the film, so much so that they said young people tend to be desensitized to these issues, but that being involved in these GCU events had really raised their consciousness about the nuclear issue. I hope that's been interesting. I think the main takeaway is that to solve a lot of the problems that Glasgow Caledonian University are wanting to solve, the media and communication environment is absolutely crucial. So if you take anything away from this session, that's what to take away, I guess.
Thank you.